We hear so much about this drop off in girls taking those tougher science and math classes as they
Mhm.
get further along in high school. It's like this ongoing thing, this real push to keep them engaged with STEM, you know?
Mhm.
And you got to wonder, what's the story there? What's happening as those girls move up in grade levels that makes them shy away from those
Oh,
subjects?
yeah, that's something researchers in education and psychology have been looking into for a while, trying to unpack that.
Yeah.
One way that's been really helpful in getting a grip on this is using something called expectancy-value theory, EVT for short.
EVT. Okay. Maybe we could for those of us who don't speak academic ease, break that down a bit. What's the idea at its core?
Yeah, sure. You could think of it like this. If a student, like let's say a high schooler, taking a tough bio class, really thinks they can nail it, that they can do well, and they see a real point to learning this stuff, then they're much more likely to dive right in. That value could be, oh, it'll be useful for their future career, or maybe they just find it plain fascinating. So when we're talking girls in STEM, if they feel confident in their abilities and see a payoff, they're more likely to hang in there with those courses.
Makes sense, right? If you don't believe you'll succeed or you just don't get why it matters, well, it's pretty natural to head in a different direction. But teenagers, they're not making these decisions in a vacuum, are they? Their family, their friends, the whole culture around them, that's all got to play into those beliefs.
Oh, absolutely. We know those social and cultural environments are huge in shaping what a student thinks they're capable of, what they consider worthwhile. And there's been a bunch of research into these broad differences we see between, boys and girls when it comes to their educational paths. But what hasn't been looked at as much is like the specific situations where those differences become really obvious, or even, and this is interesting, where those differences kind of vanish.
So not just averages of all boys versus all girls, we want to zoom in, see where those STEM attitude gaps really pop up or don't.
Yeah.
So what are we aiming for with this deep dive of ours?
You got it. It's not just saying boys like this, girls like that. On average, we're digging deeper, trying to reveal how things like social class, the cultural landscape, how all that factors in. And to do this deep dive, we've been poring over this meta-analysis. Think of it as like a mega study where researchers gather up and analyze tons of individual studies on one topic.
Yeah.
It gives us this much wider view to see those more subtle things.
Ugh, a study of studies, kind of like a superpowered research project. And you mentioned something before about gender not being the only factor here, right?
Intersectionality. It's
Right.
basically recognizing that gender doesn't exist in isolation, right? It
Yeah.
intersects with all these other parts of your social identity, like your family's socioeconomic status, your ethnic background, even the
Yeah.
community you grow up in. So this deep dive will touch on how those all come together to give us this a much richer picture of how these STEM beliefs and values develop.
It's not as simple as just boys and girls then. It's how all these pieces, wealth, background, cultural norms, how those can shift the whole dynamic. So this big study of studies, when it looked at those general boy-girl differences across all those different subjects, what did it find?
So they looked at how much students expected to succeed in the subject and how much they valued it.
Right.
They checked out math, various sciences, computing, engineering, and also those verbal areas like language arts. What's really interesting is the overall trend right off the bat.
Okay, give us the big reveal. What was the takeaway?
Generally, boys said they had higher expectations for success, and they put more value on things like math, computing, engineering, and physical sciences. These were what researchers call like small to medium effect sizes, meaning it's noticeable, but it's not like a huge difference in the data. What's interesting is when they looked closer at that math value, the biggest difference favoring boys was in how much they just inherently enjoyed math, the pure fun of it.
So, on average, boys are a bit more confident in those areas, tend to find them more fun. What about general science, not just those super specific STEM fields?
Well, with just general science, those differences between boys and girls, they were less noticeable compared to those specific STEM areas we just talked about.
And those subjects where we often see girls excelling, those verbal areas, what about those?
Exactly. Girls had higher expectations of succeeding in verbal domains and said they valued those more. But again, the effect sizes, the differences were generally small. And a really interesting one was biological sciences. There, the boys and girls were almost on par in terms of confidence, but there was a slight difference in how much they just inherently enjoyed it, with girls tending to find it a bit more engaging.
Huh. Biology kind of breaks the mold a bit. It doesn't quite fit the pattern. You mentioned earlier that the overall gender differences were fairly small, right?
Yeah, that's a key thing. Across the board, those differences in expectancy and value, they were small.
Yeah.
It actually backs up something called the gender similarity hypothesis, which says that men and women are more alike than different in a lot of psychological areas.
Hmm.
But, and this is a big but, there was a lot of what researchers call heterogeneity, meaning the results weren't all the same across all the studies they looked at. Some showed bigger differences, some smaller, sometimes even in the opposite direction. This tells us that the context where these attitudes are measured really matters.
Okay, so those averages are just a starting point. The real story is figuring out why those averages aren't perfectly uniform across the board. Let's focus on one of those context things you mentioned, social class. How does that seem to play into these gendered feelings about STEM?
So this is where it gets really interesting. They found this pattern where social class actually changes those gender gaps. Specifically, the gap where boys were more into math-like, how confident they felt, how much they valued it overall, and especially how much they just liked doing it. That gap got wider the wealthier the kids were.
Hold on, so the richer the kids, the bigger the difference. That's not what you'd expect.
It might seem counterintuitive, right? So for example, they looked at how confident kids felt about doing math. The difference between boys and girls was pretty small in those studies that looked at mostly working class families. And then it got a bit bigger with middle class samples. But when they looked at the most affluent families, that gap exploded. Boys were way more confident about math. And the same thing happened with how much they valued math and how much they enjoyed it.
That's pretty surprising. The researchers had some ideas about why this might be, right? What could explain this?
Yeah, they had a couple of thoughts. One was that wealthier families, they might have more resources to give their kids very gender-specific opportunities. Think about the kinds of after-school activities they sign them up for, the toys they buy, even the learning materials they have at home. Maybe in those richer settings, those things are more divided by gender, which could then, affect how boys and girls think about their skills and what they're interested in.
So maybe richer families, even if they don't mean to, reinforce those traditional gender roles a bit more, and that ends up shaping what their kids lean towards academically.
Yeah, that's one possibility. Another idea they had was that richer environments, they can be super competitive when it comes to school. Think about those elite private schools or that pressure to get into the best colleges. There's some research that shows generally girls might not respond as well to that crazy competition compared to boys. So in those pressure cookers, high-achieving environments, which you often find in richer areas, girls might just develop more negative feelings towards those male-dominated fields like math.
That's a really interesting point. Those high-stakes settings might affect girls differently. Now, what about other STEM subjects, not just math? Did they see those same patterns with social class there?
They had less data to really dive deep into how social class affected science and verbal subjects.
Hmm.
But they did see that for how confident kids felt about science, it was kind of similar to math. The gender gap was bigger in those wealthier samples. But they really stressed that more research is needed to say for sure if this is a trend across all STEM fields.
Okay, so social class seems to be a big factor, especially with math. What about ethnicity? How did that affect things? Like, how did the mix of ethnicities in the study groups relate to those gender differences in STEM attitudes?
This one's kind of complex. In general, whether a study had more or fewer ethnic minority students didn't really change the gender gap all that much.
So basically, no matter the ethnic makeup of the group, those same STEM attitude differences between boys and girls were usually there?
That's the general gist. But there was this one interesting exception. When they looked at math utility value, how useful kids thought math would be in their future, the gender gap favoring boys was biggest in those studies that were mostly white kids. Very little ethnic diversity. But get this, in those studies with lots of ethnic diversity, it flipped. Girls thought math was more useful.
That's a pretty wild switch up. More diverse groups, girls see math as more valuable. Any ideas why that might be?
That's a big question for future research. The study doesn't give us a clear answer, but it does make you think about how different cultures might view how important and relevant math is. But the researchers did point out a big limitation here. They were often using these broad categories like ethnic minority, which lumps together so many different experiences and backgrounds. So while we get this general idea, we really need more research that looks specifically at, say, how do girls from this specific ethnic background view STEM compared to boys from that same background? Really teasing apart those details.
Right, those big general categories can hide a lot of important differences within them. We've talked about individual stuff, group stuff. What about the even bigger picture? Does how gender equal a country is have any connection to these differences in STEM attitudes?
This is where it gets fascinating and maybe a bit head-scratching. We've got two main ideas here. Gender stratification hypothesis and gender equality paradox.
Okay, two big academic terms. What's the difference in plain English?
So gender stratification, it basically says that in countries that are more gender equal, meaning equal opportunities, societal structures, and all that, those gender differences in STEM should be smaller. The thinking is, as societies become more fair, girls feel more empowered to go for whatever they're interested in, like STEM, without facing all those old barriers and stereotypes.
Seems logical, right? More equal playing field, less difference in what boys and girls aspire to. So where's the paradox then?
The paradox says, well, in those really gender-equal societies, you might actually see bigger gaps in certain fields, especially STEM. Why? One idea is that if there's less pressure to fit those old gender roles for careers, people might feel freer to just follow what they're truly drawn to. And because of all sorts of cultural factors, maybe some biological stuff too, though, that's debated, those natural interests might still differ between boys and girls, leading them to make different choices about school and careers, even without any direct discrimination.
So even with the freedom to choose, those choices might still fall along gender lines without anyone pushing them that way. That's kind of mind-bending. So what did this big study find when it looked at that national level?
It was all over the place. When they used those big overall measures of equality, things like the Global Gap Index and the Gender Inequality Index, which try to score how well women are doing in the country, they kind of saw the paradox happening. Those more equal countries sometimes had slightly bigger STEM attitude gaps, but those effects were pretty weak.
So those general equality scores lean towards the paradox. What about more specific measures, like ones looking just at education and jobs?
Those were even more mixed up. Some results supported the stratification idea, meaning smaller gaps in more equal countries, but others still hinted at the paradox. The key thing is, most of those national level effects weren't strong enough to be statistically significant. This means, based on this study, there's no simple link between a country's overall gender equality and those STEM attitude differences. It's way more nuanced than just saying more equality, smaller gaps.
So it's not a one-to-one thing. That national level is complicated. They also looked at some other things, right? Like the age of the students, the types of students, and even when the research was done.
Yep, they wanted to see if those things mattered. Age, for the most part, didn't really change the gender differences, except for one thing with science confidence. The gap where boys felt more confident was a bit bigger in older students.
Maybe as kids get older, those stereotypes about boys in science get stronger.
Could be. And then there's the type of student group, like a general group versus those in advanced classes. That mostly didn't matter much, except for computing. The gender gap favoring boys was bigger in those elective computer science classes.
You know, that might be because there's the strong idea of who belongs in advanced computing, and that might discourage girls from even trying those classes. And what about when the study was done? Like, has that gender gap changed over time as society's changed?
For most things, it didn't really matter if the study was old or new, but there were a couple of little exceptions. For how useful kids thought math was, the gap favoring boys was slightly smaller in newer studies. And for how much girls intrinsically valued verbal stuff, that gap also shrunk a bit over time. But overall, things were pretty steady.
So even with all the progress we've made, those underlying gender attitudes in school subjects seem pretty stubborn. We've talked a lot about girls in STEM. What about boys and those verbal areas? We always hear about getting more girls into STEM, but what about the flip side?
Right, super important point. The study did find that boys, on average, were at a disadvantage in verbal stuff, both in how much they expected to succeed and how much they valued it. And those differences were similar in size to some of those STEM differences we talked about, though still small overall and varied a lot across studies.
So generally, boys are less confident about and less interested in verbal skills compared to girls. It reminds us that those gender stereotypes can limit everyone, not just girls in STEM.
It goes both ways. We've got to be aware of how these gender expectations can affect both boys and girls across all those different subject areas.
Now, this huge study, it must have had some limitations, right? Anything we should keep in mind about these findings?
Definitely. The researchers were upfront about that. A big problem was that a lot of the original studies didn't have enough information about the kids' backgrounds, like their social class and ethnicity. So it was hard to do that really deep intersectional analysis we talked about earlier.
So lots of those original studies didn't give enough specifics about the students' socioeconomic and ethnic backgrounds.
Yeah, exactly. They also said there were way too many white, middle-class American kids in the studies they analyzed. So a lot of what we know about this is based on a pretty narrow group of people, We definitely need more research with a wider range of backgrounds.
That's a common issue in social science research. What else did they point out as limitations?
Well, they had to use whatever definition of social class and ethnicity the original studies used, and those could be all over the place, not as detailed as we'd like. And they also couldn't always match up those national-level equality measures with the exact year each study was done.
So there's room for improvement in how we collect and analyze this kind of data. Speaking of what needs to happen next, what are the big takeaways for future research?
This study really shows us that we need more intersectional research from the get-go. We need to be gathering and reporting that detailed info on social class, ethnicity, and be including a wider range of people in the studies.
So moving beyond just gender and really seeing how all those other identity factors come together.
Right. They also say we need to focus on more specific things within STEM. So instead of just science confidence, look at confidence in physics or programming. Get those finer details. And they really want to see more research on boys and verbal subjects.
All good points. We need a more detailed and inclusive approach to get the whole picture. Anything else for future research?
Oh yeah, they suggest looking at other parts of that expectancy value theory that haven't been studied as much, like how much effort a kid thinks something will take or how important it is for them personally to do well in that area. Those could be big in shaping their choices, and we don't totally understand those yet.
More detailed, more inclusive, and really getting at that why behind what we see. So for you, our listener, what's the big takeaway from all this about gender, social class, and STEM?
The main message is those average differences between boys and girls, how they feel about and value STEM subjects, they might seem kind of small when you look at the big picture. But it gets way more complicated and way more interesting when you see how social class, ethnicity, and the whole cultural context all fit together. Like that surprising finding about the math gap being bigger in wealthier families. That shows us how much those context things can change the story and challenge what we might assume at first.
It makes you rethink some of the common explanations, right? It shows how some efforts to get kids more into STEM, even if they have good intentions, might work differently depending on the kid's specific situation.
Exactly. And we want you, the listener, to think about your own experiences. Have you seen these things happening in your own life, in your community, with people you know? Do those personal observations match up with what the research is saying?
It really shows that those one-size-fits-all solutions for gender equality in school and careers, they probably won't work. We need to understand all these details to create solutions that are more effective and really target the right things.
Totally agree. Understanding this complexity is how we move beyond those simplistic ideas and make things truly fair for all students.
So here's something to ponder. If a country becoming more gender equal doesn't automatically mean everyone's participating equally in STEM, what bigger changes do we need in our culture, in our beliefs, in the opportunities we offer? It's a question that goes beyond just school policies. It gets at how we see gender, identity, and what paths we encourage people to take. Keep exploring these important and fascinating questions.